So, once again, the great Quentin Tarantino has spoken out about how things are not going well with film culture, and he's speaking particularly about Star 80. But apparently, on this podcast, he ventured out, as he's said a couple times before, that he's not a big fan of the MCU films or the so called superhero genre, or whatever we're going to call them, the comic book films or fantasy films of a certain kind, in the way they're dominant in a lot of theaters nowadays, and apparently will continue to be so for a while. And he just doesn't think that's a good thing. But I want to get a little bit more precise because I was kind of confused. I mean, the idea that the MCU in particular is destroying all cinema. It's not a new thought. A lot of prominent directors have said this. Scorsese, Alejandro Inarritu. There's been a lot of big names that have come out, been very critical of the quote MCUification of all big cinema. But he also labeled the 1980s as a bad era of cinema. Okay, that's interesting. And yes, the 1950s also a bad era in cinema, which is perhaps a little curious for people because wasn't that the heyday of Alfred Hitchcock? But if you listen to Tarantino consistently, unlike some other people who just kind of pick and select what he says, apparently he's not a big fan of Hitchcock either. He doesn't seem very impressed by his filmography. He's also not a big Star Wars person. So if you bring him examples like, well, what about this or that Star Wars film? I'm sure he just like roll his eyes and say, well, he doesn't think those films were really that good in the first place. He is a big Star Trek fan. He's actually very notorious for being a Trek fan, but he doesn't take Star Wars too seriously. He doesn't take the MCU too seriously. And I would agree that the MCU in particular does have many films that I think are very questionable, and calling it great cinema, I think you'd have to make a lot of assumptions, to put it mildly, to say that, yeah, these are good or great films. But I'm on the side that the MCU is very, very mixed, but I think the DC side is a little stronger with what Snyder did and some of the other films there, like Wonder Woman, even Aquaman, which is very traditional, has very traditional action film structure, but I still think does have a little bit more depth than the average MCU film or the average fantasy film. So I'd like a little bit more information about why he thinks this era is so awful in particular. And what does he mean by this era? Does he mean 2020s? Probably not. Does he mean the 2010s? What time period are we talking about? I would assume it has to be after the 2000s because even Scorsese admits he actually liked Spider Man 1 with Sam Raimi. So he's not willing to say that it was all stupid and bad. So presumably, Batman films, the early Spider Man films, and some other films, they're sort of exceptions to the rule. And I guess it's that back then it was a healthy relationship between whatever we're going to call them, the fantasy and more realistic or more gritty or more 70s influenced films, and that it was a healthy combination. But now it's completely become disproportionate and that it's really only fantasy all the time. I think that's a little distortive if you look at just this year alone with horror. A lot of horror has actually been very excellent, like Barbarian. I thought that was really, really good. It's near flawless. It's a very small film, too. And I think it did financially well enough that hopefully they will maybe pursue, if not that story, expand the mythologies they set up there. So this year in particular seems like a not a good year to choose because there actually were a few really, really good experimental films. Again, whether they're going to get a bigger audience, that's true, but the last few years are the worst era in film. I'm like, I don't know. It just seems overall very mixed. It looks like the Ryan Johnson film coming out will be very good, be very strong. Hopefully, it will get a good enough audience. Scorsese has been able to put out some pretty big films. Like The Irishman is like an insanely large film, which might not have been possible earlier. Just getting a film of that length, even in the 2000s, would have been very unlikely. Or the Snyder Cut. It's a very, very large film as well. Something that streaming has accommodated. So again, I guess it depends on what we think are great films, who are the great filmmakers. I'd say at the moment it is mixed, but it's not totally bleak. I can see a lot of room for optimism, but so I'm kind of in agreement. But when it comes to particulars, I don't agree with him on a lot of things. I think it's like, he's very knowledgeable. He's recently put out a book expanding upon what he thinks good cinema is, but I just think it's a little skewed. It seems like good cinema to him is what he grew up with in the 1970s, and that's the standard. And by that standard, everything is lacking nowadays. But I don't know. The 1970s had its own share of questionable films, ironically, including Star Wars. That's where it came from. So it's sort of like, I don't know. But some interesting thoughts to put out. I don't want to distort what he actually said. And as always, he is a very informed person, but I don't know if I want to take everything he says on faith. But there we have it. So, is it one of the worst eras in film history? So, quite a claim. And is it as bad as the 1950s or 1980s? A lot of strong claims, but I need a little bit more to be convinced it's as dire as all that.